Welcome back to the channel where we tell stories that touch the deepest parts of the soul. What would you do if the person who ruined your life and tore your love apart was now lying there, gasping for breath and begging for forgiveness? For 10 years, James swore he'd never go back. But one phone call at sunset changed everything. Will the arrival of the grandchild he once disowned be the ultimate act of revenge or the final cure for a crumbling empire? Stay tuned to the end of this video to see the incredible power of forgiveness. Love doesn't erase the past, but it gives the future a fighting chance. If this story touches your heart, please hit like and subscribe so you don't miss our next emotional journey. Now tell me, would you be willing to forgive the person who hurt you the most? Let us know in the comments. The news came in the late afternoon, just as the city was turning that burnt orange color of sunset. James stood by the window of his small apartment, watching the crowds hurry by below. The distant honking of cars, the shout of a street vendor, the lingering heat of a summer day. Everything was so normal, it felt cruel. Then the phone in his pocket buzzed. A familiar number popped up, one he hadn't seen in years. "This is James." There was a long silence on the other end, filled only by heavy breathing and the steady beep, beep, beep of hospital monitors. Finally, his cousin's voice came through raspy and strained. "James, your father is in bad shape. The doctors say he doesn't have much time left." The world around James suddenly went silent. The news didn't feel like a punch to the gut. It felt more like ice-cold water slowly rising, soaking into his skin and numbing his senses. He just stood there, the phone pressed to his ear, long after the call had ended. Outside, the sun was sinking, leaving blood-red streaks across the skyscrapers. Life went on, but inside that room, time had stopped. In the gathering darkness, the memories James had tried to bury for years came rushing back. He remembered his father, a man with a face as stern as granite. In James's memory, his father was never a warm embrace. He was a shadow of power looming over his childhood. He was a man of iron rules, a man who believed love was a luxury that could be bought with total obedience. James closed his eyes. He could almost hear his father's voice, roaring on the day he chose Tu Diep over the career and the high society legacy his father had mapped out for him. The man, now lying on his deathbed, was the same man who had used every ounce of his influence to drive James away, to tear him from the woman he loved, and to treat his own granddaughter, little Ngi, as if she didn't exist. Irreversible. Love comes with conditions, his father used to say. Now those conditions were crumbling at the fragile edge of a final breath. In the small kitchen, Tu Diep was busy. The sizzle of oil in the pan, the smell of sautéed garlic, mixing with fresh vegetables. It was the scent of home, the comfort James had traded his youth to find. Deep froze when she saw James standing motionless in the living room. She didn't need him to say a word. Their years together had taught her. She had learned how to read the slightest shifts in the air around him. She put down her spatula, wiped her hands on her apron, and slowly walked over. "What's wrong?" Her voice was soft, but it carried a hidden edge of worry. James sank onto the sofa, his shoulders dropping as if a 1,000-pound weight had just been slammed onto them. It took him a long moment to find his voice. "It's my father. He's really sick. My uncle says I should come home." The words hung there heavy and cold. Diep went still. More than anyone, she was the victim of that man's cruelty. She remembered the long nights crying into her pillow after his family cast her out, and the sheer terror of raising a child alone while being looked down upon. By all rights, she should have felt some kind of satisfaction, or at least she shouldn't have cared. But she didn't feel that way. Instead, a quiet sense of compassion began to well up inside her. She looked into James's conflicted eyes and understood no matter how much bitterness there was. Blood is a bond you can't just cut through with a knife. "Mommy, look what I drew." Little Ungi's bright laughter rang out from the next room. She ran out, holding a colorful drawing, her innocence cutting right through the gloomy atmosphere. James looked at his daughter, then back at Diep. The real question wasn't, should I forgive him, but rather, if we don't go back, can we ever really live in peace for the rest of our lives? Diep didn't give him advice right away. She knew James needed time to face his own demons. She went into the kitchen, poured a warm cup of ginger tea, and placed it in his trembling hands. As the warmth from the cup spread, Diep sat down beside him and rested her head on his shoulder. Sometimes love doesn't have to solve everything. It just needs to be there, sitting in the dark with you until it passes. "You don't have to decide tonight," she whispered. "But whatever you choose, me and the baby are right here with you." James looked down at the floor, where the last traces of sunlight had completely faded. He knew that when the sun rose tomorrow, he'd be starting the hardest journey of his life, going back to the source of his pain, to find a release he never thought he'd need. The old car started moving, heading into the city's thick, misty rain. James's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. The windshield wipers made a steady swish-swish sound, like the frantic beat of an anxious heart. Beside him, Diep sat in silence. She didn't try to force a conversation. She knew that right now, James's mind was traveling back in time. Every mile they covered every road sign pointing toward the old estate on the outskirts felt like a knot tightening in his chest. They drove down the familiar roads James had fled 10 years ago. Back then, he had left with nothing but a scarred heart swearing he'd never look back. But today, he wasn't returning as a defeated man. He was returning as someone whose strength and grace had been forged through hardship. The iron gates of the Vuong estate appeared through the rain, rusty and imposing. The house that was once a symbol of power and pride now looked neglected. The ancient trees that used to be perfectly manicured were now overgrown, blocking out the last bit of weak evening light. James pulled the car to a stop. He took a deep breath, the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filling his lungs. "You okay?" Diep asked, lightly touching his hand. The warmth of her palm was the only thing keeping him from turning the car around and driving away right then. "I'm okay, let's go inside." Their footsteps echoed down the cold marble hallway. The sharp smell of disinfectant mixed with incense made the air feel heavy and suffocating. The old housekeeper met them with teary eyes, nodding silently as he led them to the room at the end of the hall, where the man who was once so powerful now lay. The door opened. A dim yellow light from a bedside lamp spilled over the large bed in the center of the room. James froze. The man lying there, was that really his father? Where was the man with the broad shoulders and the booming voice that used to make him tremble? All James saw now was a frail figure, skin and bones, his shallow breaths assisted by an oxygen tank. The face that once radiated authority was now carved with deep wrinkles from old age and sickness. The hatred James had built up over 10 years suddenly vanished, replaced by a strange sense of emptiness. He realized that time is the most terrifying enemy of all. It strips away everything's strength pride, leaving behind only a fragile soul clinging to life. Standing behind him, Diep looked at the man who had so heartlessly cast her out. Her heart tightened, not for her own past pain, but for how lonely he looked. In this luxury room, in his final hours, he had nothing but heartless machines. James walked to the bed and slowly sat in the wooden chair next to it. He reached out to take his father's hand, but pulled back. The wounds from the past were still there. You don't just say, "I forgive you," and expect everything to vanish instantly. Suddenly, the old man's eyes slowly opened. Clouded and exhausted, they scanned the ceiling before settling on James's face. A faint spark flickered in them. His dry lips moved, but no sound came out. Only a single tear rolled slowly from the corner of his sunken eye and onto the pillow. That was the moment James understood that while words of apology were too late, his presence, there was the only answer that mattered. He reached out again, without hesitating this time, and took his father's wrinkled, cold hand. "I'm home," James whispered, his voice breaking. Outside, the rain started coming down harder, drumming against the window pane. Diep stepped closer and placed her hand on James's shoulder, looking down at the man in the bed with a look of peace. "Sir Ngi is waiting in the car. She looks a lot like you," Diep said softly. Was it a white lie or the simple truth no one knew? But the old man's face seemed to relax just a little. James didn't leave that room all night. He sat there watching the rain streaks on the glass, thinking about the cycles of life. His father had been wrong, and James had suffered for it. But if he kept holding on to that hate, he would just become another version of his father. Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about accepting it so you don't let it hurt the future. The hospital room, already stifling with the smell of medicine, felt even heavier with the silence. But it wasn't that dead, distant silence anymore. It was the silence of a conversation without words. James's father's hand trembled in his. Those fingers, the ones that had signed million-dollar contracts and pointed orders at James his entire life, were now just brittle bones. They clung to James's hand like an exhausted traveler, gripping a branch at the edge of a cliff. James could feel his father's weak pulse against his skin. Each beat felt like a belated apology. He looked down at the age spots on the back of the old man's hand, then up at the mess of IV tubes. A thought flashed through his mind. It turns out power and control are just illusions. In the face of death, everyone is just a child afraid of the dark. Diep stood a few feet back, close enough for him to feel her warmth, but far enough to give them their privacy. She didn't say a word. She just quietly set a bag of fruit on the small table, cluttered with pill bottles and lab results. James's mother looked at her. Two women from different generations, Both victims of the same rigid prejudice locked eyes for a second. There was no judgment, no resentment. In the older woman's eyes, Diep saw a profound sense of gratitude. She knew that without Diep's grace, her son would never have stepped foot through that door. Diep gave a small, respectful nod, a gesture of incredible kindness. She took an orange and began to peel it meticulously. The sound of the knife against the rind and the fresh scent of citrus began to fill the room, cutting through the gloomy hospital smell. It was her way of bringing life and peace into the space. "Dad, how are you feeling?" James finally found his voice, though it sounded raw and unfamiliar. The old man didn't answer right away. He stared at the ceiling, his breath wheezing through the oxygen mask. Then, with a surge of effort, he pulled the mask aside. James's mother moved to stop him, panicked, but he raised a weak hand to wave her off. I thought you wouldn't come." He rasped every word, costing him a piece of his remaining strength. "I spent my whole life building an empire, but lying here, I see I have nothing but these walls." He turned to look at Diep, his gaze resting on her hands as she worked on the orange. She's better than I thought. I was wrong, wasn't I?" The question hit the cold floor like a ringing bell. James felt a surge of warmth sting his eyes. 10 years of waiting for those words, 10 years of hatred and exile, all leading to this one admission in his father's final moments. Just as the tension reached its peak, the door creaked open. Little Ngi poked her head in her big eyes, full of curiosity. She had been waiting outside too long, and her 4-year-old patience had finally run out. "Daddy, Mommy!" Her voice chirped as bright as a bird singing in a silent graveyard. The whole room seemed to light up. James's mother rushed over and scooped her granddaughter up. She had never been allowed to officially hold her like this before. James looked at his father. His heart tightened as he saw a miraculous spark of light return to the dying man's eyes. He struggled to sit up, his clouded gaze locked on the little girl's face. "Come here and see, Grandpa," James whispered, leading her toward the bed. Ngi wasn't afraid. Children have a special instinct for recognizing pain. She placed her tiny soft hand on the old man's wrinkled forehead. "Grandpa, does it hurt? Do you want me to blow on it?" Whoosh, whoosh. That gentle breath from a child felt like a miracle. This man of iron, who had never shed a tear through all the cutthroat battles of the business world, finally broke down. Tears streamed down his hollow cheeks and fell onto his granddaughter's small hand. It was the ultimate cleansing, laid into the night. The machines continued their steady beep, 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 but the rhythm didn't seem so scary anymore. James and Diep sat together on a couch in the corner, while Ngi had fallen fast asleep in her grandmother's arms. James looked out the window at the distant city lights. He realized that this visit wasn't about fixing the past, because the past is set in stone. It was about setting the present free. The storm had passed. It hadn't left behind a pile of ruins. Instead, it left the ground washed clean, where the seeds of reconciliation could finally start to grow. He took Diep's hand and squeezed it. "Thank you," he whispered. Diep leaned her head on his shoulder and smiled. We're family. That's what we do. In the hospital bed, the old man had drifted off, but this time his face wasn't twisted in pain. There was the ghost of a smile on his lips. His journey might be coming to an end, but the journey of forgiveness and love in this family was just beginning. The hospital's revolving door clicked shut behind them, a sharp sound that cut off the world of chemicals, moans, and looming death. Outside, the city was fully lit up. The afternoon shower had stopped, leaving the streets shimmering like silver under the streetlights. The post-rain air carried the scent of damp earth and the chill of late night. It hit James's face, snapping him out of a 10-year trance. James took a deep breath, feeling like his lungs had finally expanded after a decade of being choked by resentment. He didn't say anything. He just stood there watching the traffic blur past. The world kept spinning, but the axis in his heart had shifted. While James was lost in thought, a small movement brought him back to reality. Diep was shivering, not from crying, but from the night air. In the sheer exhaustion of a day filled with overwhelming emotion, James took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. As his hands touched her slight frame, a startling truth hit him. For 10 years. He had been so wrapped up in his own pain and his war against his father's shadow that he had sometimes forgotten that Diep was the one who had suffered the most. Deep, James said softly, his voice low and apologetic. I always thought of myself as the victim, but today, watching you stand there peeling oranges for the man who cast you out, it made me feel so small. Diep looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the streetlights, bright and full of grace. James, I didn't do it for him. I did it for you, for me, and for myself. Holding on to a grudge is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. I just wanted to be free. They walked toward the parking lot. Little Ngi was fast asleep on James's shoulder, her head tilted to one side, her breathing steady and incredibly peaceful. It was a stark contrast to the image of his father, lonely, frail, and wasting away in that hospital bed. Diep's words kept echoing in James's head. Family isn't chosen by power. It's chosen by the people who stay. It hit him then. His father had spent his entire life building a family based on fear and obedience. He wanted to be a king in his own home. But in the end, when that kingdom crumbled, the people standing by him weren't the subordinates who used to flatter him. It was the son he had disowned and the woman he had once looked down on. Real power isn't about controlling people. It's about who is holding your hand when you have nothing left. Just as they got into the car, James's phone buzzed again. It was his mother. His heart sank. A primal fear washed over him. Is this the final goodbye? He answered with a shaking voice. Mom, what's wrong? On the other end, there was sniffing, but it wasn't the sound of grieving. James, your father, after you guys left, he fell into a really deep sleep. For the first time, the doctor said his heart rate stabilized without needing heavy sedatives. He just woke up for a second and told me to tell you. Thank you for bringing spring early. James hung up. He leaned his head against the steering wheel, and the tears he'd been holding back all night finally started to fall. It wasn't loud sobbing, just the quiet tears of someone being washed clean. In the future, his father might recover or he might pass away in a few days. But that didn't seem to matter as much anymore. What mattered was that they were in time. They had made it in time to see each other behind the masks of ego and pride. The car started moving, leaving the hospital grounds. James looked in the rearview mirror, watching the silhouette of the building fade into the darkness. "Let's go see him again tomorrow, okay?" James asked, reaching for Diep's hand. "Yeah. We'll definitely want to bring her drawing to show Grandpa." Diep replied, her smile as soft as a late-blooming flower. Tonight, for the first time in 10 years, James knew he would sleep soundly. No nightmares about rules, no endless arguments playing out in his head. Outside the car window, the first hints of a new day were sparking on the distant horizon. One truth was as clear as that light love might not erase the scars of the past, but it is the light that allows us to see the path forward without the fear of tripping over our own pain. Time has a magical way of working. It doesn't make us forget the pain, but it covers it with a soft dust of acceptance. A year has passed since that cold, rainy night at the hospital. James stood in the backyard of the old estate, the place that used to be his father's untouchable territory. But today, the atmosphere was completely different. There was no shouting, no suffocating formality. Instead, there was the sound of Ng's giggles as she chased a yellow butterfly through the rose bushes. James looked down at his hands covered in dirt from helping his father prune the dead branches. He smiled to himself, a smile of true peace. He'd realized that tending to a living thing is a lot like tending to a relationship. It requires patience, light, and above all, the courage to cut away the parts that have already withered. From the porch, a figure slowly stepped out. It was his father. He was no longer the powerful king in a crisp suit. He was just an old man in simple pajamas, walking with a slight limp and the help of a wooden cane. Last year's illness had taken his health, but it had given him back something much more valuable, a softness in his heart. He stopped beside James, watched his son for a long moment, and then placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "That branch, you cut a bit too deep," he said. His voice was raspy, but it carried a hint of gentle teasing that James had never heard before. James laughed, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Still trying to control everything, Dad." They both went quiet for a second, and then they both started laughing. It was the laughter of two men who had made it through the storm, men who had once faced each other like enemies, only to realize they were just two souls desperate to be understood. The chime of the wind bells signaled that dinner was ready. In the estate's massive kitchen, Diep and James's mother were setting the table together. A year ago, they were strangers, separated by a wide gulf. Now they stood side by side, sharing cooking secrets and laughing about Ng's latest antics. Diep never brought up the past. She chose to treat her mother-in-law with genuine sincerity, not out of obligation, but because she saw a loneliness in the older woman that needed to be filled. It was her simple, selfless kindness that finally melted the last layer of ice in that house. As the family sat down to eat, the warm yellow candlelight reflected on every face. James looked around the table. His father was carefully trying to pick up a piece of fish for Ng. His mother looked at her husband with a tenderness she had kept hidden for decades. Diep found his hand under the table, giving it a silent, steady squeeze. The meal wasn't filled with the luxury delicacies they used to have, but it was the best meal James had ever eaten. Because the main dish on the table tonight was acceptance. Before they started, James's father raised his glass of water. The doctors wouldn't let him have wine anymore. He looked James in the eye and then looked at Diep. "I owe you both a formal apology," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I spent my whole life building walls, but you two taught me how to build bridges. Thank you for not leaving a stubborn old man in the dark." The room went dead silent. Little Nhi, not quite understanding everything, her grandpa said, just innocently held up her spoon. "I love you too, Grandpa." The little girl's voice broke the heavy emotion, replacing it with happy smiles. James felt a massive weight finally truly lift off his chest. He realized that forgiveness isn't just a one-time thing. It's a process built every day through every meal, every conversation, and every small act of care. Dinner ended just as the full moon rose high, turning the garden a silvery white. James and Diep led Nhi out to head home. As the car pulled out of the gate, James looked back at the house in the rearview mirror. It was still huge, still imposing, but now it had a soul. The glowing windows no longer felt cold. They felt like warm eyes watching over them. "What are you thinking about?" Diep leaned her head on his shoulder, her familiar scent bringing him a sense of infinite peace. "I'm thinking about the definition of happiness," James replied, his hands firm on the wheel. "It turns out happiness isn't the absence of wounds. Happiness is when we learn how to make our scars bloom together." Outside, the world kept moving at its own pace. But inside that small car, and in the house they had just left, a new chapter had truly begun. A chapter without iron rules, only hearts that knew how to open up and love completely without conditions.